of this book, and it's called Lois, Eunice, and Timothy. Not a whole lot about Lois and Eunice. They're mentioned, but it's mainly Timothy. Anybody know what Timothy stands for, what it means in Old Greek? Comes from the Greek word Timotheos. Theos is God, so Timothy means honoring God, which is a pretty appropriate name for him. And what do we know about Timothy? Well, he's an early Christian. On his raising. I don't know, y'all may have a different experience than I've had, but I can think of about 7 or 8 marriages I knew of where the fellow got married and 2 or 3 years later he ended up going to the Baptist or the Methodist or whatever with his wife. And so when your kids become of marriageable age, that's something you might want to think hard on. Okay. When Paul and Barnabas first visited Lystra, Paul healed a person crippled from birth, leading many of the inhabitants to accept his teaching. And when Paul returned a few years later with Silas, Timothy was already a respected member of the Christian congregation, as were his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice. That name Eunice, that got ruined for me a number of years ago. All I can see is faith. In 2 Timothy 1:5, as we are going to read in a second, that annotates that. Now, before we get too much more into Timothy, why don't we go ahead and do the readings that are provided for us? And these are just a small percentage of what Timothy is talked about in various chapters, various books of the Bible. Jason, you mind reading Acts 16, 1 through 5? And then Chuck, would you do Philippians? Okay, thank you.
filled with joy. When I come to remembrance, the human faith that in you, which dwell first in the land of Lois, and in mother Eunice, I before leaving you also. Therefore I remind you, stir up the good God.
Okay, thank y'all. And again, these are just, Timothy is said to have been acquainted with the scriptures since childhood. And I'm sure most of you, as you were growing up, saw that famous Rembrandt painting of Lois and Timothy. And he's a little boy about 5 or 6, and he's reading the scriptures at his grandmother's knee. And that's what he was known for, was studying and wanting to be acquainted with the scriptures, even from a small age. It's also implied a number of times, various places in the New Testament, that Timothy was kind of a timid sort of person, reserved. It doesn't mean he wasn't, faithful or he wasn't effective, but it took a special effort on his part to reach out to other people and to lead them and to speak to them. But he did it. As a matter of fact, in a number of times, Paul sent him, like he sent him to Thessalonica to see the status of the church there. And he did a good job, and he reported back, said they were in good standing in Ephesus as the leader of the church in Ephesus. Paul looked out for him. In 1 Corinthians 16:10, he wrote, "When Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease, for he is doing the work of the Lord." So he and the people did. Everybody thought very highly of Timothy. Now, an interesting thing it gets into here, because Timothy's father was a Greek Gentile, came to this, he was, as a baby, they followed his father, that he should be circumcised. Now, this seems a little odd at first blush, because we remember Paul said no, that you can't impose that as a requirement of becoming a Christian. And this was sort of a gray area here when it came to Timothy, because he was half Jewish, half Gentile in his background. Rejected that in Acts 15, verses 1 and 2. But neither was it a requirement of salvation either. So apparently, because of his half-Jewish state, Paul thought that since they were trying to teach people that were already Jews about Christianity, and the author of the book here says he believes that what Paul was doing was related to the passage in 1 Corinthians 9:20, where he says, "To the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews to those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those under the law." I'm just not sure. That's probably the best example, because Paul's not going to do something that was out and out wrong. In 48 AD to 50 AD, the Council of Jerusalem met, and at that point, it was determined that a Gentile did not have to be circumcised in order to become a Christian. So again, you might look at this and say, well, how come he was? But I think the author probably hit the nail on the head, that because he was working among Jews, he thought it would make Timothy more acceptable to the Jews if they went ahead and did this. Right. It'd be a major wall in the mind of the Jews. But you could also look at it and say, but he's a Christian now, so why would he have to do that? And the only reason you can think of it is because he wanted to have influence with the Jews so they could convert them. But as far as he himself, there was absolutely no need for him to do that. Timothy's importance and closeness to Paul is emphasized in many places in the scripture. Paul talks about him in many places. That Philippians passage that was just read, he says, I have no one like-minded who will sincerely care for your state, for all seek their own, not the things which are of Christ Jesus. But you know his proven character, that as a son with his father, he served with me in the gospel. Therefore, I hope to send him at once as soon as I see how it goes with me. So he's saying here, not only does he consider him to be trustworthy and properly dedicated to God and to Christ, but that he views him almost like a son. And there's many other places where he says similar things. When Paul was in prison and facing death, he knew that he was going to be martyred. He fervently wished to see Timothy, his close friend and co-worker. And Timothy did come to see him. At some point, it doesn't come right out and say it in the New Testament anywhere, but apparently Timothy was also imprisoned at some point. If you go to the very last few verses of Hebrews, it talks about Timothy has been freed. He's been released. So that strongly implies that at some point he was arrested as well. Another thing that's kind of interesting, if you look at the first verse or two of 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Philemon, the writings are addressed from Paul and Timothy. So he's basically considered as a co-author. And that doesn't happen anywhere else with anyone else. So that, I think, is a pretty clear indication of how much he meant to Paul, that Paul held him up on the same level as himself. And whenever he was writing these letters, these treatises to the various churches or various people, he says, this is from Timothy and me. And I think that pretty much indicates what kind of person he was. Timothy remained the leader of the Ephesian church for the rest of his life. Now, it's nowhere talked about in the Bible, but extra biblical sources tell us that in AD 97, when Timothy was 80 years old, there was a pagan festival, basically a giant orgy being held in Ephesus. And they were celebrating the pagan goddess Diana. He attempted to interfere and to stop this festival, and he was attacked by the pagans and stoned to death. So a sad ending, but it showed that he was one more in a long line of Christian martyrs. And that's pretty much it for the story of Timothy. Let's go ahead and do the questions. Where was Timothy living when Paul met him? Lystra. That's right. What was Timothy's reputation among the brethren according to Acts 16:2? Pardon? Well spoken of. He had a good reputation. What did Paul do to Timothy before they departed on their evangelistic tour? Acts 16:3. Circumcised him. Marcia's going to get the gold star today. Okay. Why did Paul want to send Timothy to Philippi? Philippians 2:19. To find out what now? Yeah, to evaluate the church basically, to see if they were being faithful and doing what they should do. Right, to encourage the church. How did Paul describe Timothy in Philippians 2:20-21? Jason? Okay, he said he was unique. There was nobody like him that cared for them and their state. What did Paul say he did for Timothy? He prayed without ceasing. And obviously the prayers worked. According to Paul, Timothy possessed what kind of faith? 2 Timothy 1:5. Sorry? Genuine faith. The life that he led demonstrated the faith that he was living. Number 8, who helped Timothy develop his faith? Mother and grandmother, Lois and Eunice. And number 9, what kind of spirit has God given Christians? Power, love, and a sound mind. Okay, so it's pretty obvious that his upbringing took, and it taught him how he was supposed to live. And even though he was sort of a second generation evangelist after Paul died, he still was a respected leader of the church up until he was 80 years old and was martyred. So the teachings that he got from his mother and grandmother obviously stuck, and he was able to lead the kind of life that he was supposed to lead and be the example that he was supposed to be to the Christians around him and also to the Jews who he was attempting to convert. And the fact that each of the churches he was associated with stayed faithful and strong is in large part a testament to what he gave to them, the fact that he established them in the right way, provided a right example for them, and all in all, I'd say that he was, a tremendous success. And in large part, that's in measure to what he was taught from that early age. And it's the same way today. Randy Wright's a good fellow because Maxine taught him right. And we can point to any number of people who, if their parents hadn't emphasized from an early age how important church is, they wouldn't have turned out that well. I remember last year, one night, there were ambulances and fire trucks up at the street, and little Everett came to me and said, "What's going on up there?" And I said, "Well, there's a fire in somebody's house apparently either that or somebody has become ill or had an accident. They send out fire trucks for that too. And Everett said, well, I don't know those people, but I think I ought to go pray for them. And I said, that's right. And that tells you he's being brought up right, because a little child like that doesn't pop up with something like that just out of the clear blue. It's because his mom and dad have been teaching him right, and he's been coming to church and learning from his teachers as well. And nobody prompted him to say that. He just on his own said, I don't know them, but I think I need to pray for them because they're in distress. And I thought that was pretty impressive for a little boy. And that's pretty much all I've got. We're a little early, but y'all can find some time to socialize, and then we'll start the worship service in just a little while. Thank you.